Last night, the person you love finally made the decision to pick you. During the quiet hours of last night, something changed that was both powerful enough to permanently alter the course of two lives and so subtle that no one else noticed. Someone sat in the light of a dim lamp while the rest of the world slept, gazing at an old conversation they had vowed never to read again. Their finger lingered on the screen. They began to breathe more slowly. All of the justifications they had been making for weeks suddenly seemed hollow. Then something unexpected occurred, not because anyone persuaded them, but rather because, at last, anxiety was subdued by stillness. Don't turn away just yet if you're wondering why that one moment was so important. The next few minutes will show a decision that had been on hold for far longer than anyone anticipated. They thought that picking you would require sacrificing something else for a very long time. Coziness. Routines that are familiar. Other people's expectations. They continued to stay motionless in the hopes that time would decide for them because every road seemed to require a sacrifice. Time, however, never did. That was altered last night. They carried questions they had never dared to honestly answer as they strolled outside under an oddly clear sky. A couple walking by chuckled together. On a porch, a family was gathered. Music drifted through an open window somewhere nearby. Together, those moments created a picture they could no longer ignore, even though none of them were very noteworthy on their own. They came to the realization that rather than approaching the individual who had consistently given them a sense of understanding, they had expended too much energy defending themselves against disappointment. Stay tight because a seemingly insignificant detail from that walk turned into a pivotal moment that nobody could have imagined. Everything appeared to be the same when they eventually got back home, but they weren't. They pulled out a drawer filled with long-forgotten memories. A handwritten note, a ticket stub, and a picture that held more sentiment than they could recall. Each piece reminded them of something unexpectedly straightforward rather than depressing them. The direction seemed to be the same in every significant recollection. In some way, every path led back to you. Unaware that they were grinning, they hurriedly averted their gaze from the mirror, nearly ashamed of the reality that was displayed on their own faces. It wasn't overly dramatic. It wasn't really loud. It was assurance. And assurance has a way of showing itself without being asked. They said something in a whisper that no one else heard before the night was out. I've had enough waiting. This is what, however, makes this story unique. That choice was just the start. By dawn, things had already begun to happen in unexpected ways, and the talk that lay ahead would determine if picking you was merely a lovely idea or the most courageous choice they had ever made. There was a strange sense of peace in the sunlight, but everything inside them was moving at once. They repeatedly groped for their phone before putting it down once more. There was no longer any hesitation. It was reverence for the moment they had at last produced. For the first time, they weren't attempting to convince or impress you, therefore they wanted every word to have a purpose. All they wanted was to be truthful. Then the morning's trajectory was altered by an unexpected chat. If you already know who brings you peace, why are you still pretending you're undecided? A casual inquiry from someone close to them struck with unexpected power. There was no witty response. Just a gentle smile that told it all, followed by silence. They realized at that moment that the longest struggle had never included other people. They had been afraid to choose pleasure for themselves. Hold on to this, because their subsequent choice showed how serious they had grown. If this story resonates with you, you might want to email it to someone who thinks that the right decisions are always made at the appropriate moment. Leave a comment, and subscribe to more tales like this one. They began removing everything that didn't belong in the future they envisioned with you, rather than waiting for the ideal opportunity. Real plans took the place of old misgivings. Talking about things that seemed unattainable at first became essential. They started talking quietly, confidently about what they really wanted instead of responding in a courteous manner to make everyone feel at ease. The others around them were taken aback by the transformation. The lighter expression on their faces caught the attention of some. Others questioned why they were so calm all of a sudden. Nobody realized that the moment they stopped avoiding the truth, serenity had arrived. They were no longer looking for hints as they combed through old texts. They were witnessing something very different, a pattern of compassion, tolerance, joy, and moments they had missed while pursuing certainty elsewhere. Every recollection turned into an additional motivation to go forward rather than backward. You haven't yet noticed this amazing detail, but it explains why this decision feels so much more significant than a typical one. They were standing in a familiar location late that night, where a lot of unresolved questions had formerly surrounded them. The vibe was different this time. There seemed to be less wind. There was no longer any misunderstanding in the silence. It was full of expectation. For a brief minute, they closed their eyes and envisioned what life would be like if they never had to ask themselves, what if? They had more hope from that one picture than they had after months of overanalyzing. They came to see that waiting indefinitely is not a sign of love. When someone at last has the guts to move toward the future they genuinely desire, it expands. They got ready for the talk that might alter everything, their hands steady and their hearts united. However, they were about to reach out when something very unexpected materialized. It felt nearly difficult to disregard a tiny sign that was related to you. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the last assurance they had been waiting for, and what transpired in the next instant would leave them with just one option. They were about to reach out when an absolutely inconceivable occurrence happened. It wasn't impossible or dramatic. It was just too important to overlook. They never expected to see your name, but it appeared in a normal place. A well-known song that you had previously laughed about together started to play through a nearby speaker. Then, only a few seconds later, they went by a street where you two had one of your best memories together. One by one, 3 commonplace occurrences came together to create an emotion they were unable to describe. They paused their stroll and allowed the quiet to envelop them. They weren't inquiring as to whether they ought to pick you for the first time. The answer to that query was already known. How to tell you everything without losing the opportunity they had nearly lost was the only question that remained. Hold on to this, for the next thing they chose to write was more true than anything they had ever said. After opening a blank message, they deleted it. Restarted. I erased it again. It wasn't that they didn't know how they felt, rather, it was that each sentence seemed insignificant compared to the overnight changes within them. At last, they gave up attempting to sound flawless. They wrote in the manner that people do when they are no longer in hiding. They acknowledged that their anxiety had prevented them from moving. They acknowledged that they had mistaken doubt for wisdom when, in fact, they had just been terrified of making the incorrect decision. Then came the statement that even they were taken aback. If I've learned anything, it's that the person you should choose is the one who makes you feel at ease. For a long moment, they gazed at those words, not believing they had finally spoken them out. There was only honesty and neither a spectacular performance nor an unachievable promise. Oddly, being honest seemed more powerful than any well-thought-out speech they had previously envisioned. However, there was one final interruption before they could hit submit, and it would expose something they had never observed before. Everything became clear after a private discussion with someone who had witnessed their trip from the start. Long after the session was over, that individual said with a gentle smile, "You stopped talking about what you were afraid of, and started talking about the future you actually want." They became aware that every recent choice they had made, every tiny action they had taken, and every unanticipated clue had been pointing them in the direction of this very evening. They took one more look at the message, inhaled deeply, and their hand remained steady this time. They were no longer hindered by an invisible wall or second-guessing. Long before their finger touched the computer, the decision had already been made in their hearts. However, the tale was far from finished. Because something occurred on your end nearly simultaneously with the moment that message finally left their phone. Something so surprising that it would have you both wondering whether two different journeys had been subtly heading in the same direction all along. Your own evening took an unexpected turn at nearly the exact moment their message reached you. You weren't looking for solutions. You were just passing through a typical moment when something subtly brought up memories you hadn't thought about in a while. A small item on a shelf, a familiar location, a fleeting discussion. They all subtly brought back memories of the bond that had never really vanished. You both got the same opportunity at the same time without realizing it, as if existence had stopped for a heartbeat. The timing wasn't the only noteworthy aspect. It was the awareness that, despite the fact that you had been leading different lives, your minds had been traveling in the same path. The next few moments will show you why this wasn't the conclusion you both anticipated, so don't turn away just yet. If this voyage has left you wondering what will happen next, you might want to subscribe, share this story with someone who enjoys heartfelt mysteries, and comment on the most unexpected moment. You didn't open the message right away when you eventually realized it was waiting for you. It felt unusual in some way. There was only a subdued feeling that whatever lay within those words merited your undivided attention, without any sense of urgency or pressure. As you started reading, there was an unmistakable genuineness in every syllable. There were no grandiose pledges or attempts to change the past. There was honesty instead. The kind that only shows up after a person has confronted themselves for a sufficient amount of time. Each sentence showed a person who had finally come to terms with what really mattered and had stopped hiding behind doubt. You could practically see them sitting there carefully selecting each word in the hopes that nothing crucial would be omitted this time. But one particular element was more noticeable than the others. They never requested a prompt response. All they wanted you to know was that, in the end, they had confidently chosen you. However, a more significant surprise was already starting to take shape. Unbeknownst to you, you were both staring at the same possibility as the evening grew quieter. For the first time, there was no misunderstanding, no unseen race, and no need to dictate what would happen next. Rather, there was an uncommon sense of equilibrium, as if two distinct tales had at last come to the point where they could merge into one. However, there was one more, lovely twist in life that was just around the corner. Another unexpected communication, coming from an entirely other direction, was already on its way before either of you could guess what tomorrow would bring. It contained facts that neither of you had anticipated. Something that would eliminate the last shred of uncertainty and explain why the choice made last night was made at the perfect time. They wouldn't just affirm that you were their choice in the next chapter. It would reveal the secret cause that made the timing seem nearly unavoidable. Neither of you could have anticipated the subtle surprise that started the next morning. It wasn't a dramatic or enigmatic communication that came from an unexpected source. It was so intimate. A basic fact was revealed by someone who had silently watched the story from a distance. Never before have I seen them so confident about anything. They weren't attempting to convince you, so those statements remained much longer than anyone had anticipated. All they were doing was summarizing the change they had seen. The hesitancy that used to permeate every discussion had vanished. The limitless, maybe someday, had subtly transformed into, I'm ready now. The shift was evident in even the tiniest things. There was a confident calmness in their voice. They smiled effortlessly. They no longer discussed the future as a far-off concept. They were now actively getting ready for it. Take one more look at this, and you'll see why this choice has been simmering within them long before last night. As the day went on, they found themselves going back to locations where there had previously been a lot of unsolved questions. But now everything felt different. It appeared brighter now, the cafe where they used to sit buried in contemplation. They were no longer reminded of uncertainty by the familiar streets. They served as a reminder of potential. They came to the realization that they had been searching so long for the ideal sign that they had nearly overlooked the many little clues that had been directing them in your direction all along. Every supportive exchange, every unforgettable shared laugh, and every unwavering memory had been subtly laying the groundwork for a foundation that was more resilient than fear. When they looked back, they realized something they had never realized before. Selecting someone takes time. It's the culmination of 1,000 tiny insights. Last night's choice wasn't rash. It was the logical conclusion to everything their hearts had been trying to teach them for a very long time. However, one last finding caused them to reconsider just when they thought they had grasped the whole narrative. They discovered something that night that they had totally missed. A letter they had written to themselves in a time of uncertainty months before. There was just one sentence in it. You'll know it's time when fear becomes more subdued than hope. After reading it slowly, they grinned with a mixture of thankfulness and incredulity. Unbeknownst to them, they had somehow reached the precise moment that their former self had been anticipating. This was the result of all the delays, lessons, and unexpected turns. They gently folded the message, put it back where it belonged, and turned to face forward rather than backward. There was nothing left to prove and nothing left to conceal for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. But there was still one lovely surprise in the tale. The two of you would be closer than ever to the talk that could turn hope into reality before the next day ended, leaving both of your hearts to wonder whether this was finally the start they had been yearning for all along. Neither of you had ever had such peaceful assurance as the following day unfolded. There was a clear sense that things were finally heading in the right way, but there was no dramatic countdown or race against time. They were no longer concerned with saying the right thing or practicing hypothetical interactions. Rather, they concentrated on being totally authentic. The serenity that results from making a decision with all of your heart was present in every stride they took. Then, as the afternoon appeared to be typical, yet another unforeseen moment came. They didn't respond right away when someone said, "You look different today." What changed? With a smile. They didn't say, "I stopped waiting for life to happen. I finally chose the person who always felt like home." Instead, they just calmly gazed out at the horizon. Things were said because things had come to pass. Hold on, because what follows will show you why your silent admission opened a door that neither of you anticipated. Although neither of you initially realized it, later that night, your paths became closer than before. Different windows reflected the same city lights. The sky above you both was painted by the same sunset. Nearly at the same moment, the same sense of optimism took root in your hearts. With each hour that went by, it seemed as though the distance that had before been insurmountable was getting less. They were no longer envisioning a perfect future. They were getting ready to construct one open dialogue at a time. They grinned at the irony as they considered all that had brought them to this moment. They thought that picking you would be the most difficult choice of their lives for a very long time. The hardest thing had actually been coming to terms with the fact that happiness may be easy. Every residual uncertainty silently vanished into the background as they accepted that reality. This connection seemed greater than either of you had anticipated, but there was still one more piece of the tale that needed to be disclosed. They briefly glanced up at the sky as night fell once more before turning back to the road in front of them. They no longer required permission to follow their instincts, so they stopped looking for indications. It had been sent. They had told the truth. The decision had been made. This was the lovely part, letting life grow organically, fearlessly, without pretense, and without looking back. You found yourself grinning somewhere, almost simultaneously, for reasons you couldn't quite put your finger on, as if your heart had silently realized that something significant had finally changed. You could both sense its direction even if you couldn't see the full picture yet. And that's what made this conclusion so remarkable. It felt nothing like a conclusion. It seemed like the first page of an entirely new chapter, written by two individuals who ultimately realized that the best choice isn't picking between options but rather having the guts to choose each other.